Hello, and welcome, dear listener. Tonight, I invite you to step away from the noise of your own century and into a quieter one. Paris, in the years following the war, when the lamps along the Seine still burned a little dim, and old wounds had not yet learned to close. High above the city, in the winding streets of Montmartre, in a modest apartment with a view of the white dome of Sacré-Cœur, an elderly woman was found dead one grey morning. There was no sign of struggle, no stolen jewels, no broken door, only this, clutched so tightly in her cold hand that the concierge had to pry back her fingers one by one, a single, ornate key. A key that fit no lock in the building, a key, it would seem, to nothing at all. But as any student of human nature will tell you, and there is one man in particular who has made a most successful career of it, nothing is ever to nothing. Every key opens something. It is only a matter of finding the door. This is a story of a promise made in youth, a war that tore two people apart, and a secret that waited, patiently, for over 30 years to claim one final victim. Before we begin, if tales such as this, of old Paris, old secrets, and the little grey cells that unravel them, are to your taste, do consider staying a while longer with us. It costs nothing but your evening, and I dare say it is time well spent. Now then, let us begin at the beginning. The letter from Paris. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Hercule Poirot considered, on the whole, an unremarkable day for a letter to arrive. And yet this particular one arrived with such urgency stamped upon the envelope, 3 underlines beneath his name, and a smear of ink where the writer's hand had evidently trembled, that he set down his coffee before he had finished it, which was, for Poirot, no small concession. It was from Madame Yvonne Charpentier, a woman he had not seen in perhaps 15 years, though he remembered her well enough, a striking widow of considerable energy whom he had once assisted in a small matter concerning a forged signature and a disputed vineyard in Provence. She was, if his memory served, 71 years of age now, which put her only a handful of years his junior, a fact he did not care to dwell upon. My dear M. Poirot, the letter read, I would not trouble you if I did not believe the matter urgent, and I would not call it urgent if I did not believe, in my heart, that the police have already decided the answer before they have asked a single proper question. My oldest friend, Héloïse Vasseur, was found dead in her apartment in Montmartre 3 days ago. They say her heart simply stopped. She was 78, and it is not, I am told, an unreasonable thing for a heart of 78 years to do. But I knew Héloïse for over 50 years, Monsieur Poirot, and I tell you there was something in her hand when they found her that no dying woman clutches by accident. Please, come to Paris. I will explain everything when you arrive. I have not been able to sleep. Poirot read the letter twice, refolded it along its original creases, and looked out of the window at London, which was engaged, as it so often was, in a light and persistent drizzle. George, he said to his valet, who had entered to remove the coffee things, we will require the boat train. Tomorrow, I think, if it can be arranged. Very good, sir, said George, betraying no surprise whatsoever, which was one of the qualities Poirot valued most highly in him. Paris, when Poirot arrived the following afternoon, wore the particular grey of a city that had seen too much and said too little about it. The war had been over a decade now, but one still noticed things. A gap between buildings where something had once stood, a certain economy in the way older Parisians spoke of the past, as though rationing the words themselves. Madame Charpentier received him in her small salon on the Rue Lepic, with both hands extended, and an expression of such evident relief that Poirot felt, not for the first time, the peculiar burden of being a man in whom people place their last hope. You have not changed at all, she said, which was flattering and untrue in equal measure, and Poirot, who possessed no false modesty on the subject of his own appearance, merely inclined his head and touched the ends of his moustache, as was his habit when receiving a compliment he intended to accept without argument. Madame, you wrote to me of a key, he said, seating himself with great precision upon the very edge of a striped armchair. "Tell me everything, if you please, and tell it to me in order. I find that grief, however genuine, has a most disorderly effect upon the memory, and it is order, madame, which the little grey cells require above all things." Madame Charpentier folded her hands in her lap and began. Héloïse Vasseur had lived alone in a fourth-floor apartment on the Rue des Trois Frères for nearly 30 years, a narrow, book-lined flat with a balcony that looked out toward the white curves of Sacré-Cœur, so that in the evenings, she used to say, she could watch the church turn from grey to gold to grey again, like a woman changing her mind 3 times before dinner. She had never married. She had worked, for most of her life, as a translator of English novels, a quiet and respectable occupation that had earned her a quiet and respectable independence. She was not a woman of secrets, in Poirot, or so I believed, for 50 years. We met in this very street when we were girls of 19, before the war. The first war, you understand, though I mean the second, the one you and I both remember rather too well. We were close as sisters, closer perhaps, for sisters quarrel over inheritances, and I do not believe Héloïse and I quarrelled above 3 times in half a century. "And yet," said Poirot gently, "you write to me that there was something in her past she did not share." Madame Charpentier's hands tightened upon each other. "There was a young man, before the war, the Second War. I never learned his name. She spoke of him only once, many years ago, after too much wine one Christmas Eve, and never again, though I asked her, gently, more than once over the years. She said only that he went away in 1940, and that he had promised to come back for her, and that he never did. I assumed, as one assumes such things, that he had died. So many did. And the key. The concierge, Madame Roux, found her in the armchair by the window, quite peacefully, as though she had simply fallen asleep over her book. But her right hand was closed so tightly around a small key, an old key, ornate, the sort one does not see made any longer, with a bow shaped like a fleur-de-lis, that Madame Roux said she had to work the fingers open one at a time, like unclasping a brooch that has rusted shut. The doctor said it meant nothing. Old hands close upon things, he said, when the heart stops suddenly. It is only a reflex. And you do not believe him? I believe, Monsieur Poirot, that in 30 years I never once saw that key, nor heard Héloïse speak of it. And I do not believe a woman clutches a stranger to her own life quite so fiercely in the last moment before death, unless that stranger has, in fact, been the truest companion of her heart all along. Poirot was silent a moment, turning this over with evident satisfaction, for it was precisely the sort of small human detail, inconsistent, illogical on its surface, and therefore, to his mind, enormously promising, that made a case worth the trouble of his little grey cells. "Where is this key now, madame?" "The police returned it, along with her other effects, to her solicitor. I have seen it myself. I could draw it for you, if it would help, though I have never had the talent for drawing that Héloïse had." A small, sad smile crossed her face. She sketched, you know, beautifully. It was the one artistic thing about her, apart from the languages. And this key, it fits no lock in her apartment. None. Madame Roux tried it in every door on the floor, and the cellar, and the attic storage. Nothing. It is, Monsieur Poirot, a key to nothing at all, and I confess that thought troubles me more than almost anything else. Poirot rose, straightened his waistcoat with 2 brisk movements, and permitted himself, for the first time since his arrival, a small and private sigh. The sigh, perhaps, of a man who has crossed the Channel at considerable inconvenience to himself, and finds, upon arrival, that his suspicions of a genuine mystery have been almost entirely confirmed, which ought to please him, and yet somehow leaves him feeling rather more tired than triumphant. He was 70 years old, or thereabouts, a fact he permitted himself to acknowledge only in the privacy of his own thoughts, and never, under any circumstance, aloud. And there were mornings now, he would admit only to himself, when the boat train seemed a longer journey than it once had, and the stairs to a 4th-floor apartment seemed a taller order than the case perhaps warranted. "And yet, Madame Charpentier," he said, "I believe I should like very much to see this apartment, and I believe, further, that I should like to speak with this Madame Roux, and with the solicitor, and, if she can be found, with anyone at all who might recall the name of a young man who left Paris in 1940 and did not, as he had promised, return." Madame Charpentier's eyes filled, briefly, with something that was not quite hope and not quite grief, but stood, perhaps, in the narrow space between the two. "Then you will help me, madame," said Poirot, reaching for his hat and permitting himself the smallest and most correct of smiles beneath his moustache. "Hercule Poirot has come a very long way to disappoint no one. Let us go and see this key that opens nothing, for I promise you, it is my considerable experience that no key opens nothing. It only waits, madame, for someone patient enough to find the door. The key that fit no lock." The Rue des Trois Frères climbed steeply from the Boulevard de Clichy, and Poirot, standing at its foot and looking upward toward the fourth floor of number 22, felt his knees register a private objection, which he chose, with dignity, to ignore. Madame Roux, the concierge, was a stout woman of perhaps 60, with the permanently suspicious expression of a woman who has spent 30 years deciding who may and may not be permitted past her loge, and who has therefore come to regard the entire human race as an ongoing series of applicants. "Another detective," she said, when Madame Charpentier made the introductions, in a tone that suggested she had already met several and found them wanting. The police were very thorough. They said it was the heart. "I have no doubt they were thorough, madame," said Poirot, with the particular courtesy he reserved for people who might otherwise prove obstructive. "And I do not come to contradict them. I come only to satisfy an old friend's grief, which, you will agree, is a different matter entirely from satisfying the law." This seemed to mollify her slightly. She produced a ring of keys from her apron and led them up 4 flights of narrow stairs, complaining gently the entire way about her hip, the war, the price of coal, and the general decline in the quality of tenants since the building's better days. A monologue which Poirot found, in its way, rather more informative than she perhaps intended, for a woman who notices the decline in her tenants is a woman who notices a great deal else besides. "You knew Mademoiselle Vasseur well?" he asked, pausing on the third-floor landing under the pretense of admiring the ironwork of the banister, though in truth he wished a moment to recover his breath without being observed to require one. 30 years I have kept this building, monsieur, and in 30 years I never once had cause to complain of her. Quiet, paid on time, kept to herself, mostly, though she was pleasant enough on the stairs. A cat she had, Mimi, a grey thing, half-blind now, poor creature. I have it in my rooms until someone decides what's to be done with it. Did she receive visitors? Madame Charpentier here, of course. And a niece, once or twice a year. From Lyon, I believe, though I never learned her Christian name, only that mademoiselle called her ma petite. And there was a gentleman who came, perhaps 6 or 8 times over the last year. Older gentleman, very correctly dressed, always brought flowers. I assumed him a suitor, though at their age, she shrugged, in the particular way of a Frenchwoman who considers romance among the elderly a mild curiosity rather than an impossibility. Poirot's moustache gave the smallest twitch, which was, in those who knew him well, the equivalent of another man leaping from his chair. "A gentleman. You did not think to mention this to the police?" "They did not ask, monsieur. They asked only whether anyone had broken in, and no one had, for the door was locked from the inside and the windows 4 floors up. What was there to tell? They had reached the 4th floor. Madame Roux fitted the key into the lock with the ease of long familiarity, and the door swung open upon a room that struck Poirot, in the instant before he had even crossed the threshold, as being not the room of a woman who has died suddenly, but the room of a woman who has been waiting. It was a narrow apartment, but not a poor one, walls lined floor to ceiling with books in both French and English, a small writing desk beneath the window bearing an unfinished translation, its pages held down by a smooth grey stone, and, drawn close to the window, an armchair upholstered in faded rose velvet, angled. Poirot noted this with particular care, not toward the room, nor toward the door, but toward the window itself, toward the white dome of Sacré-Cœur rising above the rooftops in the afternoon light. "This is where she was found?" "Just there, monsieur, sitting, as if asleep, her book fallen to the floor beside her." Madame Roux pointed with something almost like tenderness. "It was I who found her. I bring up the post on Thursdays, as she was, not always steady on the stairs. I knocked, and when there was no answer, and Mimi was crying at the door, I used my key." Poirot crossed the room slowly, his eyes moving over every surface, with the particular, unhurried attention that George had once likened, not entirely to Poirot's satisfaction, to a cat inspecting a room for mice. The bookshelves held a life's careful accumulation: Balzac beside Dickens, a row of dictionaries, a small collection of English detective novels, which Poirot noted with private and considerable approval. On the writing desk, alongside the unfinished translation, stood a single silver-framed photograph. A young woman, dark-haired, laughing, standing beside a young man in a linen jacket on what appeared to be a riverbank. The Seine, perhaps, sometime in the middle 1930s, if the fashions were any guide. "Madame Charpentier. This young man, do you know him?" Madame Charpentier came to stand beside him, and something in her face changed as she looked at the photograph. A softening, and then, almost at once, a kind of pain. "I had forgotten this photograph entirely. Yes, that is Héloïse, of course. Perhaps 1938. And that," she touched the glass lightly with one finger, "I do not know his name, M. Poirot, but I believe that is the very man of whom I spoke, the one she loved before the war. I never saw his face before today. She kept it, all these years, and never once showed it to me." Poirot lifted the frame carefully and turned it over. On the back, in a hand grown shaky with age, but still legible, someone had written a single line in pencil, so faint it might almost have been made yesterday, or 40 years ago. There was no way, from the pencil alone, to tell, "Un jour, tu reviendras, et je serai là." "One day, you will return, and I will be here." "She wrote this," murmured Madame Charpentier. "Recently, I think. The pencil is too fresh for 30 years. Poirot set the frame down with great gentleness, precisely where it had stood, and turned his attention to the desk drawer beneath it, which Madame Roux, with a permission granted by a shrug rather than words, allowed him to open. Inside lay old letters tied with faded ribbon, a passport long expired, a handful of francs from before the currency reform, and, tucked beneath all of it, as though placed there to be found only by someone who troubled to look, a small brass hinge, the sort fitted to a box or a case, snapped clean in two, as though something had once been forced open, or shut, with considerable violence. "Now that," said Poirot softly, almost to himself, lifting the broken hinge between two fingers and turning it to catch the light from the window, "is interesting. That is very interesting indeed. A key that opens nothing, madame, and a hinge, broken, from a box we have not yet found. I begin to think that Mademoiselle Vasseur's heart did not fail her without a certain amount of assistance from her memory, for it is my experience that the heart, however old, does not so often break upon its own initiative. Someone, or something, generally helps it along." He slipped the broken hinge into his waistcoat pocket, where it settled against the watch he no longer trusted to keep accurate time, and looked once more toward the window, where Sacré-Cœur stood pale and patient against the grey Paris sky. The last thing, he did not doubt, that Héloïse Vasseur had ever chosen to look upon. "Madame Roux?" he said, turning back with sudden briskness. "This gentleman who visited with flowers. I think it is now very much time that we learned his name." The letters tied in ribbon. Madame Roux, it transpired, did not know the gentleman's name, but she knew, with the unerring precision of concierges the world over, where he had come from, for she had once, quite by accident, glimpsed the return address upon an envelope he had left with her, to be given to Mademoiselle Vasseur, on an occasion when the lady had been out. "A hotel," she said, frowning with the effort of memory. "Not a grand one. The Hôtel Beauvoir, I believe, near the Gare de l'Est. I remember thinking it curious. A Parisian gentleman, staying in a hotel in his own city, as though he had no home to go to, or did not wish to be found in it." Poirot thanked her with the particular warmth he reserved for concierges, whom he considered, on the whole, to be the most underrated witnesses in all of criminal investigation, and turned his attention, instead, to the bundle of letters he had found tied with ribbon in the drawer, for Madame Charpentier had, after some hesitation and a glance toward Madame Roux that received a small nod of permission, agreed that he might read them, since Héloïse has no family left to object, save the niece, and I do not think she would mind, if it helps to find the truth. They sat together at the small writing desk while the afternoon light moved slowly across the books, and Poirot untied the ribbon with the careful patience of a man who has learned, over a long career, that haste destroys more evidence than it ever uncovers. The letters were dated between 1937 and 1940, written in a strong, sloping hand, signed always with a single initial, J, never a full name, as though the two correspondents had shared some private joke about the unnecessary formality of surnames between people who already knew each other's hearts. "My dearest Héloïse," read one, dated the spring of 1939, "I sat again today on our bench by the river, and thought how absurd it is that a man of my age should feel his chest tighten simply from watching the water where we once sat together. Your father remains unconvinced of my prospects, and I cannot entirely blame him. A translator's assistant with more books than francs is not, I grant you, the son-in-law any sensible man dreams of. But I tell you now what I have told you before. Give me 2 years, perhaps 3, to establish myself, and I will come to him with something more than poetry in my pockets, and he will not refuse me then. Wait for me. J. Another, from the autumn of the same year, spoke more darkly of mobilization orders, of a regiment forming, of a departure that could no longer be postponed by love or by argument. And the last of all, dated the 14th of May, 1940. A date, Poirot noted grimly, that fell only days before the German breakthrough at Sedan, when half of France's careful peace collapsed within a single terrible week, was shorter than the rest, the hand less steady, as though written in haste, or in a place not suited to writing at all. Héloïse, we move east within the hour, and I do not know when I will be permitted to write again, or where. Keep the key safe, as I asked you. You know what it holds, and you know it holds nothing so precious as what I feel for you, which no lock in the world could contain in any case. When this madness ends, and it will end, whatever they tell us, I will come to the apartment on the Trois Frères, and I will knock 3 times, as I always did, and you will know it is me, and not the war returning to trouble you further. Until then, my heart is at Sedan, but it is also, entirely and always, in your keeping. J. Madame Charpentier had gone quite pale, reading over Poirot's shoulder. Sedan, she whispered. M. Poirot, you know what happened at Sedan. I know, madame, that the French line broke there in the 3rd week of May 1940, and that many thousands of men who marched east that spring did not march west again, some killed, many taken prisoner, and not a few simply lost to the chaos of that terrible retreat, their fates unknown to their families for months, sometimes years, sometimes never. He set the letter down with great care upon the desk. It would explain a great deal, would it not, if this J had been among those who vanished into the confusion of that collapse, reported neither dead nor living, simply gone, in the way that whole regiments sometimes were in those first chaotic weeks. A young woman receiving no further word might reasonably conclude, after months of silence, that her lover had died. And yet, "And yet the key," said Madame Charpentier softly. "Keep the key safe. Monsieur Poirot." She did. For 30 years she did. Poirot rose and walked to the window, looking down into the narrow street where a knife-grinder's cart was passing, its bell ringing faintly, one of the last such carts left in a Paris that was rapidly modernizing itself into forgetfulness of its own recent past. He found himself thinking, not for the first time in his long career, of how very patient grief could be, how it did not always announce itself with weeping, but sometimes simply sat in a rose velvet armchair for 30 years, facing a window, waiting. "Madam, I believe our gentleman of the flowers, staying so curiously in a hotel in his own city, may have a great deal to tell us about a certain J who marched east from Paris in May of 1940. I think further that we ought not delay in asking him. Grief that has waited 30 years may yet be patient a little longer, but I have a growing suspicion, madame, that this case does not concern only the dead. I think perhaps it concerns someone who is very much alive, and who has, for reasons of his own, been rather less than honest about it." He turned back from the window, and there was something in his expression now, not the pleasure of an interesting puzzle merely, but a certain gravity, as of a man who begins to see, however dimly, the shape of an old sorrow about to be reopened. "Come, madame, the Hôtel Beauvoir is not, I think, so very far from here, and I find I am suddenly most impatient to learn a gentleman's name. The gentleman who gave a false name. The Hôtel Beauvoir proved to be exactly the sort of establishment its name had suggested to Poirot's practiced ear. Modest, respectable, the kind of hotel favoured by provincial visitors of limited means and old-fashioned habits, its lobby smelling faintly of beeswax and yesterday's coffee. The clerk at the desk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, consulted his register with the exaggerated importance of someone rarely asked to consult anything at all. "Monsieur Jules Fontaine," he announced at last. "Room 14, though I should tell you, monsieur, madame, that he checked out only this morning." Poirot's moustache drooped, very slightly, in a manner that George would have recognized as disappointment held under the strictest control. "Checked out? He left no forwarding address, I suppose?" "None, monsieur. He paid in cash, and asked only that his post, should any arrive, be held a fortnight before returning it to sender." "And has any post arrived, by chance, in the days he stayed here?" The clerk hesitated, weighing discretion against the evident authority of the small, formally dressed gentleman before him, and discretion, as it so often did in the presence of Poirot's particular manner, lost. "There was a telegram, monsieur, 2 days past. I could not say what it contained, of course, but he read it in this very lobby and went quite white, and asked me directly after for the times of trains to Lyon." "Lyon," repeated Madame Charpentier, and Poirot saw her hand tighten upon the strap of her handbag. "Monsieur Poirot, the niece, Héloïse's niece, lives in Lyon." Poirot felt, for a moment, the particular fatigue that comes not from the body, but from the recognition of complexity multiplying where one had hoped, however unreasonably, for simplicity. For a case that had begun as a single locked door and a single unyielding key was proving now to possess corridors leading in several directions at once, and he was, whatever the vigour of his little grey cells, a man of 70 years, standing in a hotel lobby that smelled of old coffee, uncertain, for a moment, which corridor to take first. "Monsieur," he said to the clerk, drawing himself up with fresh purpose, for uncertainty was a luxury he permitted himself only briefly, and never in company. "You will describe this Monsieur Fontaine to me, if you please, in the greatest detail your memory allows." "An older gentleman, monsieur, 70, perhaps older, grey hair, very correctly parted, a slight limp, favouring the left leg. He walked with a stick, though I always had the impression he did not entirely need it. An old wound, perhaps, from the war. Softly spoken, always alone. He asked, now I think on it, most particular questions of the staff about a lady who lived nearby, on the Rue des Trois Frères, whether anyone knew her, whether she was in good health, that sort of thing. I did not think much of it at the time. Elderly gentlemen do sometimes make such inquiries, monsieur, about elderly ladies." Poirot exchanged a glance with Madame Charpentier that required no words between two people of sufficient intelligence to draw the same conclusion simultaneously. "A limp," murmured Poirot, half to himself, as they descended the hotel steps into the grey afternoon. "A limp, madame, and a war wound, and a man who inquired after Mademoiselle Vasseur's health from strangers rather than presenting himself openly at her door until, what was it Madame Roux told us, only these past 12 months, after silence of some 30 years. There is a story here, and I do not yet have all of it, and that, I confess to you frankly, troubles me more than it once would have. I am not so young as I was, madame, and I find these days that I prefer my mysteries to unfold a little less like a Paris traffic circle, with exits in every direction and no clear sign as to which one leads home." It was, for Poirot, an unusual admission, and Madame Charpentier looked at him with something like surprise, and then, gently, with sympathy. "You are tired, Monsieur Poirot. You came all this way at a moment's notice." "I am," said Poirot, with the particular dignity of a man confessing a fact he does not entirely enjoy confessing. "Very slightly tired, madame. It happens, I am told, even to the finest of instruments, after sufficient use. But a tired mind, properly disciplined, is still a mind, and I have not yet met the mystery that could not be resolved by a good dinner, a strong tisane, and the systematic application of order to chaos. Come, we shall telegraph to Lyons this evening, to this niece of hers, and we shall discover whether Monsieur Fontaine has business with her that concerns an old key or an old promise." The telegram to Lyons was sent that evening from the post office on the Boulevard de Clichy, addressed to a Mademoiselle Renée Vasseur, at an address supplied, after some searching, by Héloïse's solicitor, a Maître Dubois, a dry, precise little man who received Poirot the following morning with the wary courtesy of a lawyer, uncertain whether he is dealing with an ally or a complication. "The estate is not large," Maître Dubois explained, consulting a thin folder with evident relief at having something concrete to discuss. "The apartment, its contents, a modest sum in savings. The niece, Mademoiselle Renée Vasseur, is the sole heir, a schoolteacher in Lyons, unmarried, by all accounts a sensible young woman. I have written to inform her of the inheritance, though I understand from Madame Roux that she has not yet come to Paris to claim it. And the key, maître, the ornate one found in Mademoiselle Vasseur's hand. It is here, monsieur, among the effects returned to my office, pending settlement of the estate." Dubois produced it from a small strong box and laid it upon the desk between them, and Poirot leaned forward to examine it properly for the first time. An old key indeed, brass gone dark with age, its bow wrought into the shape of a fleur-de-lis, its teeth cut in a pattern Poirot did not immediately recognize, though something in its proportions struck him as belonging not to any door, precisely, but to something smaller. A box, a case, a thing built to be carried, and hidden rather than fitted into a wall. He turned it over slowly in his fingers, and there, on the underside of the bow, so small as to be almost invisible without close inspection, he found a maker's mark, 2 letters, entwined. B.F., Maître Dubois. Do you know a locksmith, perhaps, or a craftsman of the old school, who might recognize such a mark? Dubois considered. There is old Bertrand Fabre, a locksmith on the Rue Ravignon, not 5 minutes from here. His family have made keys and small strong-boxes in Montmartre for 3 generations. If anyone in Paris could tell you what that key was made to open, monsieur, I should think it would be him." Poirot closed his hand gently around the key, feeling its weight, heavier than its size suggested, as certain small objects so often are, freighted as much with what they have carried as with what they are made of, and rose from his chair with something of his old briskness restored, the fatigue of the previous evening set aside, for there is nothing, he had long ago discovered, so restorative to a tired mind as the scent of a trail growing warm. "Then, maître, I think we shall pay a visit to Monsieur Bertrand Fabre without further delay. A key, after all, is only half a mystery until one has found the thing it was made to open, and I begin to believe, most strongly, that we are rather closer to that thing than we were this time yesterday. The locksmith's ledger. Bertrand Fabre's shop on the Rue Ravignon was the sort of establishment that seemed to have declined, quite deliberately, to acknowledge the passage of the 20th century. A narrow front between a bakery and a shuttered milliner's, its window displaying an assortment of keys, hinges, and small iron boxes arranged with the patient artistry of a man who took genuine pride in objects most people never troubled to look at twice. The locksmith himself was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders despite his age, with the permanently blackened fingertips of a man who had spent a lifetime at the forge. He took the key from Poirot's palm with the particular reverence of a craftsman recognizing a fellow craftsman's work, turned it once toward the light of the window, and gave a short, satisfied grunt. "My father's mark," he said. "B.F. Bertrand, the same as myself, for I was named for him, and he for his father before that. This is old work, monsieur. Prouar, I would say." He turned it again, examining the wear along the teeth. 1938, perhaps 1939. We made very few of this particular pattern. It is not a door key, you understand. Too small, too fine a cut. This is a key for a coffret, a small strong-box, the kind a gentleman might commission to hold letters, or jewellery, or documents he did not wish disturbed. Can you tell us who commissioned it, monsieur? Fabre's face grew thoughtful, and he disappeared for some minutes into the back of the shop, from which came the sound of drawers opening and ledgers being disturbed from long rest, before he returned with a slim, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle. My father kept meticulous records, a habit I confess I have not entirely maintained myself in this busier age. Here. He laid the ledger open upon the counter, his finger tracing a line of faded ink. March 1939. A coffret with matching key commissioned by a Monsieur Julien Ferrand to be delivered to an address on the Rue des Trois Frères. Poirot felt Madame Charpentier's hand grip his sleeve, quite without her seeming to notice she had done it. "Julien," she whispered. "The letters, Monsieur Poirot." "They were signed only J. I never once thought—" "Monsieur Fabre," said Poirot, his voice very level, very controlled, the voice of a man who has found the thread he sought and does not intend, through excitement, to let it slip now. "Do your father's records tell us anything further of this Monsieur Ferrand? His profession, perhaps, or where he resided?" "Only that he was a young man, for my father has noted here, in the margin." Fabre squinted at the faded hand. "Jeune homme, amoureux. A young man, in love. My father was sentimental in his way, monsieur, for all his precision with a chisel. He liked to remember which of his commissions were for lovers and which for misers, and he generally guessed correctly which was which by the manner of the ordering. This one, he thought, was for a man building something to hold a promise, not merely valuables. Poirot stood very still for a long moment, the pieces arranging themselves before him with the particular, satisfying click of a lock, finally yielding to the correct key. For it was now no longer difficult to imagine what that coffret had once held. Not jewellery, not documents of business, but the private treasury of a young man's courtship. Letters, perhaps a ring he could not yet afford to offer openly to a father unconvinced of his prospects. Tokens of a love he intended, in time, to make permanent and public. Monsieur Fabre, one final question. Did your father's ledger note where this Julien Ferrand resided at the time of the commission? Fabre traced the line once more. Here, a lodging house on the Rue Lepic, monsieur, though I could not tell you if it still stands. So much has changed. They thanked him and stepped back out into the narrow street, where the afternoon had begun to soften toward evening, the light turning the color of weak tea against the pale stone of the buildings. Julien Ferrand, said Madame Charpentier slowly, as though testing the name for the first time against 30 years of unanswered questions. M. Poirot, if this is our man, our Monsieur Fontaine of the Flowers, why would he give a false name at his hotel? Why creep about asking strangers after her health rather than simply going to her after all these years? It was, Poirot reflected, turning the very question that had been troubling him since the moment the hotel clerk had described a limping, softly spoken gentleman who asked after Héloïse Vasseur's welfare like a man uncertain of his welcome, or perhaps uncertain of something rather graver than mere welcome. There are, madame, only a limited number of reasons a man conceals his own name from the woman he once loved. After 30 years of silence, he did not himself choose to break. Either he is ashamed of what became of him in those 30 years, a wife, perhaps, taken in the belief that his first love was lost to him forever, a life built upon the assumption of her unavailability, or his own presumed death to her, which he did not trouble, for whatever reason, to correct. Or, Poirot paused, and something in his expression grew graver still. Or he did not come merely to renew an old acquaintance at all, madame. He came because of what that coffret still contains, and he did not wish his interest in it to be observed too closely, by her or by anyone else. Madame Charpentier stopped walking entirely, there upon the pavement, and stared at him. You believe he came for the box, not for her? I believe, madame, that grief and greed wear remarkably similar faces at 70 years of age, and it takes a more careful eye than most possess to tell the two apart at a distance. I do not yet say which face Monsieur Ferrand wears. But I will tell you this. A man who visits 8 times with flowers, who then vanishes upon a telegram from Lyon, who gives a false name to his hotel and asks after a woman's health from strangers rather than from herself. This is not, I think, the behavior of a man whose only business is love. It is the behavior of a man managing something, watching something, waiting perhaps for something to conclude before he shows his face too openly. They had reached the corner where the Rue Ravignan met the little square with its acacia trees, and Poirot stopped, resting one gloved hand upon his cane, and looked back up the hill toward the white dome of Sacré-Cœur, glowing faintly gold now in the last of the afternoon light. The very view. He did not need reminding that Héloïse Vasseur had chosen to face in her last moments, her hand closed around a key to a box that a locksmith's ledger, 30 years old and gathering dust, had just revealed to hold not jewelry nor money, but the private evidence of a young man's promise. Madame Charpentier, I think we have delayed too long already in one matter. We must find where that coffret itself is now. For Héloïse kept the key safe, as Julien asked of her in his last letter, but a key kept safe for 30 years suggests to my mind that the box itself was kept safe also, somewhere close at hand, in that apartment we have already searched once, and evidently not thoroughly enough. And we must also learn, with some urgency now, I think, precisely what business calls a man named Julien Ferrand, alias Fontaine, so suddenly and so anxiously to Lyon, at the very moment his old love lies newly in her grave, and her sole heir, a schoolteacher who has not yet come to claim what is hers, resides in that very city. He turned from the view of the church with visible reluctance, as though it, too, were a witness he had not finished questioning, and set off back down the hill with renewed purpose, Madame Charpentier hurrying to keep pace beside him. "You think René is in danger," she said, and it was not entirely a question. "I think, madame," said Poirot grimly, "that we have uncovered a story of lost love that I began this morning by finding rather touching, and that I am rapidly coming to find rather sinister instead. A promise 30 years unkept is one thing. A promise 30 years unkept, followed within days by a death the doctor called natural, and a telegram that sends a mysterious gentleman fleeing toward the sole heir of the estate. That, madame, is quite another thing altogether, and I do not intend to wait patiently to learn which of the two we are truly dealing with." The box behind the books. They returned to the Rue des Trois Frères, as the last light was leaving the sky, and Madame Roux, roused from her evening meal by Poirot's insistent knock, admitted them once more to the fourth-floor apartment, with the resigned expression of a woman who had begun to suspect that this particular set of visitors intended to make a habit of her stares. "You searched the desk already," she observed, as Poirot moved past her into the room and stood, quite still, in its centre, turning slowly upon his heel to survey the space as though seeing it for the first time. "I searched the desk, madame, yes. But I did not, on our first visit, search as a man searches who knows precisely what he is looking for. A coffret, small enough to be concealed, yet large enough to hold letters and perhaps a ring, kept close at hand by a woman who faced her window every evening for 30 years, waiting." He turned his attention now to the armchair itself, running his gloved fingers along its underside, its arms, the seams of its faded rose velvet, and found nothing. He straightened, frowning, and his eye fell instead upon the bookshelves that lined the wall beside the window, floor to ceiling, and in particular upon a lower shelf where the books, he now noticed, stood not quite flush with those above and below, as though something behind them created a shallow but persistent obstruction. "Madame Charpentier, be so good as to help me with these." Together they removed perhaps a dozen volumes, Balzac, Flaubert, a row of English novels, and there, set into a shallow recess clearly built into the shelving itself, likely by a carpenter engaged for the purpose many years before, sat a small iron-bound box, no larger than a hat-box, its surface dulled with age but its lock, Poirot saw with a rising satisfaction he did not trouble to conceal, precisely matching in style the fleur-de-lis pattern of the key that had been found clutched in a dead woman's hand. "Mon Dieu," breathed Madame Charpentier, 30 years, and I never knew it was there. I sat in this room 100 times, Monsieur Poirot, and never once suspected." "That, madame, was rather the point of hiding it," said Poirot gently. He drew the key, which Maître Dubois had, with some reluctance and considerable insistence from Poirot regarding the urgency of the estate's proper investigation, permitted him to borrow, from his waistcoat pocket, and fitted it to the lock. It turned with a small, tired click, as of a mechanism grateful, after so long, to be asked to perform its single function once more. Inside lay precisely what the elder Fabre's ledger notation had led Poirot to expect, and something more besides. A bundle of further letters, older still than those found in the desk drawer, tied with a second ribbon gone entirely to grey. A small velvet box containing a modest ring, not costly, but chosen, Poirot judged from its simple design, with evident care by a young man of limited means and considerable devotion. A single dried flower, pressed flat and brittle between two sheets of paper that might once have been a violet. And, at the very bottom, folded separately from everything else, and evidently placed there more recently than the rest, the paper crisp still, not softened by decades as the letters were, a single sheet, dated, Poirot noted with a sharpening of attention, only 18 months previous. He unfolded it carefully and read, and as he read, his expression grew graver by degrees, until Madame Charpentier, watching him, felt her own breath catch in sympathy with whatever she saw gathering in his face. "My dearest Héloïse," it began, in the same strong, sloping hand as the wartime letters, though the strength of it had thinned somewhat with age. "You will forgive me, I hope, for the manner and the lateness of this return. I did not die at Sedan, though I confess there were some years afterward when I might as well have, for the man taken prisoner there in May of 1940 did not come home again for nearly 5 years, and the man who did come home was not, I think, entirely the one you had promised to wait for. I will not burden you with the particulars of the camps, save to say that a man learns, in such places, a great deal about what he can survive, and rather less about what he deserves to survive for. When I returned to Paris in 1945, I made inquiries, Héloïse. I want you to know this above all things. And I was told, by someone I believed I had no reason to doubt, that you had married. I did not learn until very recently, and by an accident I still can scarcely credit, that this was a lie, and a cruel one, told to me by a man who wished the field left clear for himself. I built a life on that lie, Héloïse, a wife of my own, now some years past, children grown and settled, and I do not regret the years I do not unlive, for they gave me a family I love dearly. But I have thought of you, and of this box, and of that key, every single year of the 30 that have passed, and when I learned the truth at last, I could not simply let the remainder of my life go by without seeing your face once more, however foolish, however late. I do not ask you to forgive 30 years. I ask only to sit with you a while, if you will permit it, and to tell you, at last and in person, that I never stopped keeping my promise in my heart, even when my feet had, through no true fault of mine, wandered so very far from it. Julien Poirot lowered the letter slowly, and for a long moment neither he nor Madame Charpentier spoke at all, the small room filled only with the last grey light from the window and the faint, distant sound of the city settling into evening below. "He came back," whispered Madame Charpentier at last. "He came back, after everything, and she never told me, not one word." "She told no one, I think, madame, because there are certain joys and certain griefs that a woman of Mademoiselle Vasseur's generation and temperament preferred to hold entirely to herself, private even from her dearest friend, as though speaking of them aloud might somehow diminish them." Poirot's voice was unusually gentle. "But you will observe, madame, what this letter tells us that is of the very first importance to our inquiry. Monsieur Ferrand speaks of someone I believed I had no reason to doubt. A man, he says, who wished the field left clear for himself. A man who told him a deliberate lie in 1945 to keep Julien Ferrand away from Héloïse Vasseur, and who has, we must now presume, remained in her life in some capacity ever since, undetected, while Julien built an entire second existence upon a falsehood not of his own making. Who, Monsieur Poirot, who would do such a thing?" "That, madame," said Poirot, folding the letter with great care and slipping it into his breast pocket, his eyes travelling once more to the rose-velvet armchair, angled so faithfully toward the window, "is precisely the question that has, I now believe, cost Mademoiselle Vasseur her life. For I do not think for one moment that a heart, however old, chooses so conveniently to fail, only days after a 30-year promise, has finally, at long last, been kept. Someone did not wish Julien Ferrand's return to succeed. Someone has been guarding a lie for 30 years, and a guarded lie, madame, when it senses itself at last discovered, does not go quietly into the night. It fights, and I very much fear that Héloïse Vasseur was not permitted to enjoy the ending she waited 3 decades to receive." He crossed to the window and looked down once more into the darkening street where the lamps were beginning to glow along the Rue des Trois Frères, and his voice, when he spoke again, had taken on the quiet, deliberate tone of a man assembling, piece by piece, the final shape of a truth he did not relish confirming. "Madame Charpentier, I think the time has come to gather everyone who touches this matter into a single room. Monsieur Ferrand, wherever his flight to Lyon has now taken him or brought him back from, the niece, Mademoiselle Renée Vasseur, Madame Roux, who has seen more from her loge than she perhaps realizes she has seen, and one further person, whose name I do not yet say aloud, because I wish to be entirely certain before I do. Tomorrow evening, I think, in this very room, beneath that window, for it is my long experience, madame, that the truth is most reluctant to hide itself in the very place where the lie was first allowed to grow comfortable. The promise 30 years, kept. They gathered the following evening as the light was fading once more over Montmartre. The little apartment on the Rue des Trois Frères crowded now with chairs borrowed from Madame Roux's own rooms. The rose-velvet armchair by the window left conspicuously, deliberately empty. Julien Ferrand arrived first. An upright man despite his years and his limp, his grey hair very correctly parted as the hotel clerk had described. His face bearing the particular exhaustion of a man who has crossed and recrossed his own life's most painful chapter twice within a single week. He took a seat near the door, as though uncertain of his welcome, in a room he had, after all, only twice before been permitted to enter. Renée Vasseur arrived next, a slight, serious young woman of perhaps 30, her eyes red-rimmed with a grief that Poirot noted, with private satisfaction, appeared entirely genuine and entirely fresh, and not at all the practiced grief of someone rehearsing a part. And last of all came Madame Roux, settling herself near the door with the watchful stillness of a woman who has spent 30 years observing this building's comings and goings, and fully intends to observe this one as closely as any other. Poirot stood by the window, the coffret upon the writing desk before him, the fleur-de-lis key resting beside it, and Madame Charpentier seated near enough to reach for his sleeve should the moment require it, which, from her expression, she rather suspected it would. "I thank you all for coming," Poirot began, "though I do not think any of you were entirely surprised to be asked. I wish to speak, this evening, of a promise made in 1940 and of a lie told in 1945, and of the 30 years that lie was permitted to stand between two people who loved each other and who might, had the truth been told, have spent those 30 years together rather than apart." He turned to Julien Ferrand, whose hands had tightened upon the head of his cane. "Monsieur Ferrand, you were taken prisoner at Sedan in May of 1940, and did not return to Paris until 1945. Upon your return, you made inquiries after Mademoiselle Vasseur, and you were told she had married. This was untrue. Will you tell us who told you this?" Ferrand's voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "A friend of the family, a man who had known Héloïse's father before the war, and who had, I believed, no reason on earth to lie to me. He told me she had married a lawyer, moved to the south, that it would only cause her pain to learn I had survived after all. I was a broken man in 1945, monsieur. I had no money, no prospects, a body that did not work as it once had. I believed him because it was easier, in my exhaustion, to believe a happy ending had been found for her elsewhere than to imagine presenting myself, in the state I was in, and asking her to wait for me further. I built a life. I am not proud of how easily I let myself be persuaded, but I built a life, and only 18 months ago did I learn, by the purest accident, a chance remark at a funeral, of all places, from an old acquaintance who mentioned Héloïse Vasseur had never married at all, that I had been deceived. And you came to her. I came to her, slowly, cautiously. I did not know how to explain 30 years to a woman I had wronged, however unwittingly. I visited 8 times before I found the courage to tell her the whole truth, and when at last I did, 3 weeks ago, she wept, and she forgave me entirely, and she told me she had kept the key safe every single day since 1940, believing, in her heart, that I would return for it one day, even after she had given up hope of it in her mind. We agreed I would return the following week to speak with her formally, properly, as I had once meant to speak with her father. His voice broke slightly. She died 4 days before I was to come. I did not even learn of it until the telegram from my own daughter, who had heard it from a mutual friend and thought I ought to know before I embarrassed myself further. I fled to Lyon in panic, monsieur, not from guilt, but because I did not know what else to do with grief that had no right, in the eyes of the world, to call itself grief at all. Poirot inclined his head slowly. I believe you, monsieur. But you have told us there was a friend of the family who lied to you in 1945. A man who wished, in your own words from a letter I found in that box, the field left clear for himself. I ask you now, do you know who this man was? Ferrand shook his head. I never learned his name. He wrote to me, monsieur. He did not call in person. The letter is long since lost. It was at this moment that Madame Roux, who had sat throughout in perfect stillness near the door, made a small sound, not quite a word, but the beginning of one, quickly suppressed, and Poirot's eyes moved to her with the swift, precise attention of a man who has been waiting the entire evening for exactly this reaction. Madame Roux, you have kept this building for 30 years. You told us yourself that you notice a great deal. I think, perhaps, you noticed rather more than you have yet told us, concerning a gentleman who called upon Mademoiselle Vasseur with some regularity, long before Monsieur Ferrand ever returned to Paris. The room's attention turned toward her, and Madame Roux's stout composure faltered for the first time since Poirot had made her acquaintance. "Maître Dubois," she said at last, very quietly. "The solicitor. He called upon her perhaps twice a month, for years, for decades, monsieur, always on the pretext of estate matters, though she had precious little estate to discuss. I thought it romantic, in my way. An old friend, devoted. He arranged everything for her, her small investments, her lease, even helped find her the translation work that kept her comfortable all these years. I never thought—" She stopped, her hand rising to her mouth. Poirot nodded slowly, as though a final piece had settled at last into a shape he had suspected for some hours, but had wished, out of fairness, to confirm before naming it aloud. "Maître Dubois, who received me with such careful discretion only 2 days ago, and who told me, if you recall, madame, this to Madame Charpentier, that Mademoiselle Vasseur's estate was modest, and who produced the key from his strong-box with the weary correctness of a man merely performing his duty. Maître Dubois, who has managed her affairs for some 30 years, ever since, I would wager a great deal, the very spring that Julien Ferrand did not return from a German prisoner of war camp to claim the woman he loved, and a young, ambitious solicitor saw, in that silence, an opportunity to make himself indispensable to a woman he had, I believe, loved himself for a very long time, and hoped, eventually, patiently, to win by simple constancy where a rival had failed to win by promise, and hoped, eventually, patiently, to win by simple constancy where a rival had failed to win." He paused, and his voice grew quieter and graver. "A patient man, mesdames, messieurs, may wait 30 years for a hope that he privately nurtures never quite dies, the hope that constancy, given time enough, might succeed where passion once failed. But when, after 30 years, Julien Ferrand walked back into that hope and threatened, within a matter of weeks, to make 30 years of patience worthless, I believe Maître Dubois found himself facing a truth he could not bear to accept a second time. Not merely to lose her again, but to learn that he had cost himself 30 years for nothing, for she had never, in fact, been unavailable to him at all, only waiting, all along, for a promise he alone had chosen to conceal. "You believe he killed her," said Renée Vasseur, speaking for the first time, her voice trembling. "My aunt, you believe her own solicitor. I believe, mademoiselle, that a man capable of maintaining a 30-year deception for the sake of a hope he was not entitled to is a man capable, when that hope collapses entirely and irreversibly, of a single act of terrible finality, a small quantity of digitalis, perhaps easily obtained by any man of standing who knows a sympathetic pharmacist, slipped into an evening tisane during what would have appeared, to any visitor received warmly and without suspicion, to be nothing more than a routine call from a trusted old friend discussing estate matters. Enough to still a heart already 78 years old without any mark that a busy doctor, seeing nothing amiss in an elderly woman found peacefully in her chair, would think to look for. He drew from his pocket the final letter, Julien's letter of return, and held it up. She died, I believe, within days of finally telling Maître Dubois the truth herself. For what woman, having just been reunited at last with her lost love, would not wish to release herself entirely from 30 years of another man's quiet devotion, however kindly meant? She told him, gently I do not doubt, that Julien had returned, that the deception was known, that she would not need his services, nor his company, in quite the same way any longer. And Maître Dubois, mesdames, messieurs, could not bear to lose, in a single afternoon, both the woman he had waited 30 years for, and the last 30 years themselves, revealed suddenly, as having been spent in vain. The room was utterly silent. Madame Charpentier had gone quite white. Renée Vasseur wept openly now into a handkerchief. Julien Ferrand sat with his head bowed, his cane forgotten against his knee. "The key," Poirot finished quietly. she clutched in her final moments. "I believe, mesdames, messieurs, not by accident, nor by mere reflex as the doctor supposed, but because in her last conscious moment, understanding perhaps what was happening to her and by whose hand, she reached for the one object that had carried her through 30 years of waiting, and held to it still, as though it might yet, even then, keep its promise to bring her lover home to find her. It could not save her life, but it has, I think, helped us to see clearly enough who took it from her. It fell to the Paris police in the days that followed, to confirm through more conventional means what Poirot's little grey cells had already assembled from a broken hinge, a locksmith's ledger, and a solicitor's rather too careful discretion, and Maître Dubois, confronted at last with the full weight of 30 patient years laid bare, did not, in the end, trouble to deny it. Poirot took his leave of Paris 3 days later, standing once more at the foot of the Rue des Trois Frères, with Madame Charpentier beside him, the boat train waiting at the Gare du Nord. "You will see them married, I think," he said. "Julien and— No, forgive me, madame, that ending was not permitted them. But I understand Monsieur Ferrand visits the grave each week now, with flowers, as he once visited the apartment, and that Mademoiselle Renée has asked him to speak of her aunt whenever he is able, so that the years neither of them shared with her might yet, in the telling, be given back a little." "And the key, Monsieur Poirot?" "The key," said Poirot, permitting himself, at last, a small and genuine smile beneath his moustache. "Mademoiselle Renée has asked to keep, madame. She tells me she intends to wear it always, on a chain about her neck, not because it opens anything any longer, but because, as her aunt understood far better than any doctor or any solicitor ever did, some keys are kept not for what they unlock, but for what they promise to remember." He climbed aboard the train, and as it pulled away from the platform, Hercule Poirot allowed himself, for once, the small and private luxury of closing his eyes, not from fatigue exactly, though there was certainly some of that in it too, but from the particular, quiet satisfaction of a man who has, once again, found the door that a small and patient key was always waiting, all along, to open.